Yeah, once it starts.
Yeah, there we go.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this, the first of the Faroes Shetland Research Symposia for 2025. We've had some wonderful sessions in 2024, and I have no doubt that 2025 is going to be equally as good, if not better. And to start off this year, we thought that it would be a good idea to explore some of the PhD research that's being done in the Northern Islands. We're probably going to have several of these sessions because there's such a lot of good research being undertaken. But today we're going to focus on, I suppose, island-based social science research. And we've got a number of excellent PhD researchers with us who are going to share the research, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussions afterwards. So I'm not sure that everyone is who's going to be speaking is actually with us at the moment, but that's fine. If someone can't make it today, we will have other options in future. But I can welcome today Rógvi Olavson. I know that's how you pronounce your name, Rógvi, because I used to go to JEGV, and we used to wonder, how do you pronounce JEGV? So they're very nice to meet you. We have Adele. Yeah, I got a gold star for that. That's good. And we have Adele Lidderdale from Institute for Northern Studies, who's based in Orkney. Hello, Adele. Great to see you. And we have Sissal Dahl with us as well. Now, Sissal, if you could turn on your camera, that would be grand. I did make you a presenter, but I'll just check that. Oh, where's Sissal gone? Sissal's disappeared. Let's press. Oh, and then. For some reason, it's not working. Okay. Well, Sissal, yeah, if you try and re-enter, that'd be a great idea. We'll see how that goes. And we were hoping that Erica Clarkson would join us, but her work with the Scottish Government sort of affects her availability at times. So we'll hope to see her, but if not, it's not a problem. We can get Erica at a later time. Now I see one person, new activity. Let's see. Okay, let's check that. Sissal's back with us again. Hello, Sissal. Made you a presenter.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Ah, great, it worked. Hello, nice to be here. Good to see you.
Excellent, good to see you too. And if you just remind us where you're based at the moment.
I'm based in the north of the Netherlands, in Groningen.
Very good, excellent. So what I'll do is I'll get everyone to just introduce themselves before they start their presentation, and we'll have a great discussion afterwards. So I think, Sissal, since you went out and managed to get back in, and you've told us that you're in the Netherlands, maybe you'd like to start.
Yeah, well, I can give a short presentation. I am, yes, indeed, in the north of the Netherlands at the moment, not an island. There are islands close by, but I am an islander from the Faroe Islands. I lived now many years abroad, and I left my islands, the Faroe Islands, to get a bachelor's, master's, and now I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen, where I work with a lot of the island-related activities that I have at the university as well. And and my PhD focuses on islands and care.
Wonderful, excellent. So, would you like to give your presentation in? See if the share button works.
Let's see. Share window. Oh no, share screen probably. Right, 1 second. You usually don't use Teams, so share screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see ourselves on your screen.
All right, because I cannot see that I am sharing. Can you see my presentation now?
That's it. Perfect. Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, good. I'll try to time myself. If I'm way over time, then please let me know and I will speed it up or round off. And I tried to talk this through earlier, and unfortunately I did not manage to stay within 15 minutes. So let's see how it goes. But yeah, I'm very happy to be here. This is a great initiative. And I'm also very happy to be here, although I am affiliated with the University of Groningen, but I try to be engaged with island research and island communities, and also my own and the University of the Faroe Islands. So I'm happy to be invited. And as I mentioned, I'm a PhD student at the University of Groningen, the Faculty of Spatial Sciences. My PhD is on islands and care, and it's co-funded by the Faculty of Spatial Sciences and the Research Council of the Faroe Islands. And I quite recently started this journey. So this is a project that's still very much being developed, being formulated. So what I'm doing today is a bit of taking you along, thinking along in ways to engage with islands and care, and share my my current stage, my process, also my thought process. So I very much welcome any comments, reflections, insights, also if they're critical. So yeah, more or less what I have been interested in and engaged with throughout my education and research work is what the barriers and enablers are to care and be cared for in different contexts. And this can be connected to the broader issue of the care crisis, which is a global crisis that it is experienced differently in different ways locally, but it's often tied to political, social, cultural, economic, and demographic changes. It's an intersectional crisis. It's highly gendered, and it increases different inequalities, but it has a very far-reaching impact. And so my background is in human geography, and in very broad terms, this means that I examine more or less how space and place shapes who provides care, who is cared for, and how this then is reflected in broader inequalities. And I'm interested in this specifically in the context of islands, and there are different reasons, way more reasons than what I put on this slide, but just to give a brief insight into this, and also not trying to start a discussion on what an island is and is not, and how we can generalize or if we cannot, but short, islands risk increased pressures on care due to size, isolation, and changes that all places are experiencing, but are significant in islands, for example, demographic shifts. And then at the same time, islands are also found to be places of strong social networks. And there are different care strategies in place in islands that are very inspirational, and that I think can be informative for places and locations outside of islands as well. And then also islands are confined places, and they are ideal for studying complex social phenomena and also understanding local impacts of global changes. So a small introduction of what this research is, or the broader problems, issues, discussions that this research is positioned within. Now I'll go straight into it. So what I'm doing with this PhD is, or what I'm aiming with this PhD research is to gain a comprehensive and holistic understanding of local pressures on care in island communities. And I will focus on how care is practiced and experienced and understood in everyday life. And I'll do this through I'm doing this through a comparative study. So I'm looking at the Faroe Islands, Lesbos in Greece, and the Wadden Islands in the Netherlands. There are different reasons for this that I will not explain in detail right now, and one of the reasons why I'm not explaining it in detail right now is that I'm still figuring out exactly what to focus on for each case. So for each of these case studies, I will look at a specific dimension of care. So this also means that the comparative approach I'm taking is not aiming to specify differences and similarities. It's more trying to get three different insights to three different dimensions of local realities of care and local pressures of care in island communities. When I said yes to this presentation, I had an idea of what I was doing. Now, as I said, I'm in early process or in early stages of this research. So now I'm not so sure anymore. It continuously changes. And therefore, and yeah, I have not done any empirical research yet. My first fieldwork in the Faroe Islands is planned for later this spring. So instead of spending this presentation talking about theory and also theory that's not generated with or within islands, I'm taking you with me to the start of this PhD project, and without becoming too technical and specific on how PhD projects and research function within the faculty I'm affiliated with, then I am connecting my PhD work with my master thesis. So the PhD work is a continuation of what I did for my master thesis, and the outcome of the master's work is also part of the output of the PhD. And I'm saying this because what came out of the master thesis work is the foundation of the framework that I'm applying in this PhD. So while I don't have a specific focus for each case yet, I have a framework that I'm following. And this framework was identified through the empirical work I did for the master thesis. And that's what I will tell you a bit more about today. So yeah, my master thesis research was about change, and it was about change in the Faroe Islands, specifically in the capital of Tórshavn. And you can say that the trajectory of change in the Faroe Islands since around the early 1900s has really pushed the islands from being a periphery to a continuously growing nation. And it is a story of economic progress and development, and it's very much tied to the outward-looking and male-dominated fishing industry. And with this research, I wanted to gain a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of change, because this national story of change is so entangled in the fishing industry and economic development that it fails to be diverse and inclusive, and it therefore also limits our understanding of what it means to be a Faroe Islander today. And so what is mainly missing from this story are women, and women on the Faroe Islands have and continue to be and express dissatisfaction with their everyday lives. And there are different reasons, and there is research done on this. And some of these dissatisfactions are tied to traditional social attitudes, highly gendered labor markets, and for example, when it comes to everyday care, then Faroese society relies on informal family relations, traditional gender roles. And in addition to this, then rising living costs and the need for dual income households also adds to a pressure on everyday life and a gender pressure on everyday life. And this is a part of the reason why women are dissatisfied with life on the islands, and also impacts quite a high gendered population disparity. So the objective of this research was to explore the overlooked stories of change and how we can enhance our understanding of women's lived island lives, and an understanding that can both address the gender dimension of everyday life and its geographic island context, and ground this in women's own experiences of change. So to meet this objective, I conducted life history interviews with 12 elderly women in Tórshavn, the capital of the Faroe Islands, and I only asked them one thing, which was to them to tell me about their lives. And this also means that I didn't apply a predefined understanding of change, but wanted to understand it through their lived experiences. And through this came two main findings. First, that the stories the women told of the experience of change were especially stories of changing unpaid labor and care practices. So, for example, stories of changing domestic responsibilities, changes in the caring for children, for the elderly, and managing social relations. And what I find very important to stress is also that these changes were not told as if they just happened upon the women. They were active actors, and they were often driven by emotions and affect. For example, the women vividly recall the city in the 1950s, rapid population growth, housing shortages, limited job opportunities, and this really left a burning impression and was a huge motivation for the women I talked to gain an education. And but yeah, in addition to this, while the women did actively influence change and were active actors, they were not the only actors, and they did really emphasize the positive changes that they had experienced in their lives, and they also stressed that they did not want to seem like they thought the past was better, but they did also express sadness and frustration when talking about the city today, the contemporary city, because despite their efforts to live a different life, then unpaid and informal care responsibilities are still a big part of women's everyday lives. And this was not the future that they had imagined or strived for. And then secondly, in the women's life histories, changing care and changing care practices was really intertwined with their movements and their relations abroad. So going abroad to gain educations, to have paid jobs, to have access to care and welfare services that were otherwise unavailable on the islands, and also to care for family and for friends. And this has been and continues to be a very common strategy for women to navigate life on the islands. So we can say that it's really through these movements and relations overseas that the women have both embodied and brought back change, which is also visible in some of these quotes. And while this outcome is not directly linked to economic development like the fishing industry, then it's still greatly influenced Faroese society. And so when these were the findings I came to after doing inductive rounds of coding and analysis, and then when afterwards connecting it to theories and concepts within human geography, which I earlier said is my background, I found it very useful to address and understand care as a social infrastructure, which is a growing focus within human geography. And in short, social infrastructure refers to networks, services, and relationships, both formal and informal, that support and sustain well-being and functioning of communities and societies. For example, healthcare, education, and also caregiving. And so through this lens, the stories that the women told are detailed explanations of the complex relationship between care as an informal social infrastructure that is lived and embodied, and the fluctuating availability of formal and physical care infrastructures, such as kindergartens and nursing homes. And then secondly, and where the island dimension becomes especially visible, the women actively navigated and embodied their continuously changing island life with and through movements and relations overseas. And this really aligns with literature within island studies that challenges the idea of islands as isolated and instead finds them to be interconnected and relational places. So in other words, care as a social infrastructure on the Faroe Islands expands beyond the physical island borders, and change is experienced, lived, and embodied in and through these infrastructures. And the gendered discontent with island life can be linked to the lack of investment, not only in the material social infrastructures that facilitate care, but also in the people that live and sustain them. And that was a very long explanation to say that in order to understand the nuanced and complex and gendered realities of island change, we need to bring attention to care. And in my work and in this PhD project, I find the application of a critical infrastructure lens, this critical infrastructure lens to care to be a very productive way of engaging with care as a complex system of both formal and informal provisions and practices that respond to global pressures. But then tying it to the island context and to the island studies literature, these infrastructures are not confined to the island. They expand beyond it. We need to include mobilities, movements, migration, transnationalism into the understanding of infrastructure, infrastructures of care, and social infrastructures. And yeah, as I mentioned, I'm still developing the cases. The Faroe Islands will be my first field work, and I am still figuring out exactly how I will address care in the Faroe Islands. Yeah, I can also mention here that my idea is to, for each of the case, to focus on one of these three infrastructure, the three dimension of infrastructures of care, while still acknowledging that they are integrated and they impact each other. And so with the case of the Faroe Islands, a question I have at the moment, it's not my research question, but it's just what I'm kind of trying to think along, is what happens to care when connectivity and spatiality and scale shift at a rapid pace. And this is in the connection to interconnecting infrastructure in the Faroe Islands. What happens in the meeting between care infrastructure and physical infrastructure development? And that is, yeah, like the overarching question I'm now trying to develop my case from. And any feedback and comments to this is very welcomed. And yeah, lastly, I did not include references, at least not many references in these slides. If you're interested, there are more readings. And then I also want to mention that Island Studies colleagues and I have started an Islands and Care Forum. So if you find what I talked about now to be interesting, or just care in general, all the different ways we can understand and address care, then you're very welcome to join this forum. You can send me a message, and yeah, we meet regularly to discuss the different ways we can understand and address islands and care. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sissal, and absolutely bang on time as well. So that was great. Yeah, I'm sure people have some questions they'd like to ask. So I've asked them just to put those in the chat. I think we'll maybe hold off on the questions until the end. But yeah, if people would like to put some stuff in the chat, because care is such an international. The problems of care are so international. We have them in Scotland. Here it's a very controversial subject with the National Care Service that they attempted to set up. And my insight into Shetland Council was that they didn't want to have a national care service because the care provided in Shetland is better than the average across Scotland, and they felt that having a national care service would sort of water down what was available here. But yeah, so many interesting parallels, and I think your fieldwork is fascinating as well. So we'll come back to some questions about that later on. So thank you very much indeed. Excellent. And I think I can see Rógvi there on the screen. So maybe Rógvi would like to go next.
Sure, thanks. Thank you. Nice to meet you all. At least the people I can see the faces of. Nice to meet you. Do you want a short presentation first, or should I just jump into the topic?
Whatever you'd like.
Well, it's nice to be in this symposium because I did my undergraduate at the University of Aberdeen, so it's a bit of feel a bit of a kinship to everything that has to do with Scotland and the British Isles. And I went further on. I did my master's at the LSE, and then I went to Copenhagen, did another master's when there was a financial crisis and there was no job available. So I did some more studying. Anyway, so I've worked in Denmark and in the Faroe Islands since, and then just commenced my PhD in crisis management a couple of years ago. So this this presentation is a bit of probably just a reflection on, like, an amalgamation, I guess, of the things that I've worked on so far. I've published a couple of articles and I have a third one in review, but this is a bit of a mix of everything. I'll just see if I can find that one. Can you see this?
Absolutely. Yep.
Full screen and everything.
Full screen and everything. Faroese.
Yeah. So basically, I'm working on resilience, and I'm mostly my point of departure is mostly the COVID-19 pandemic, although I'm also working a bit on critical infrastructure in the Arctic and in the Faroe Islands and so on. Pretty much interested in everything that has to do with risk planning and crisis governance. And I enjoyed Sissal's talk there, because when she talked about care as critical infrastructure, I'm going to make a similar point later on. So I think there's always some overlap when people talk about infrastructure or structures, critical structures for societies. So just to start off, in 2010, there was quite a serious earthquake in Haiti. And I start here because I want to talk about what is this thing that we call resilience. It's a bit of a buzzword right now in academia. Everyone talks about resilience and robustness, societal resilience. And in Haiti in 2010, there was a big earthquake, and between 100 and 160,000 people lost their lives back then. And only a few weeks after, there was another earthquake. The one in Haiti had been 7.0 on the Richter scale. And then in Chile, only 6 weeks later, there was another earthquake, which was 8.8 on the Richter scale, which is, I don't know, 2,000 times as powerful as the other one. But this time, only 600, I'm saying only, but 600 people lost their lives, which is only a fraction of the death toll in Haiti. So what happened there? There's a bit of a famous comparison within crisis governance literature. Why is there such a big difference between these two societies? And well, what they found out after was that basically it was infrastructure. It was lack of trust in Haiti, poor buildings, bad governance, lots of corruption, just all these different things that we associate with low resilience. So basically, the conclusion of this comparison is that it's not the actual event that is the catastrophe; it is our response, and it is the robustness. Basically, it's it's the critical sort of variable that we have to look at there. It's our response and not the actual earthquake that is. So this was in Chile. And but in those two societies, earthquakes are, of course, quite it's a predictable kind of crisis in those two societies, because those are very seismically active places. What happens when we have crises that are not so predictable? What happens if we have things that sort of blindside us? So we have this famous concept developed by, well, I'm going to come on to that. So what happens when we have this world where things are becoming more and more inconsistent and unpredictable? How do you plan for these things? I mean, and should you plan for things that are completely unlikely? I mean, are you throwing lots of resources into something that might never happen? Or should you, I mean, what do you plan for? To plan or not to plan is basically the question here. So this is I think this is quite a good description of the current situation by Chris Ansel at the UC Berkeley, who writes that turbulence is a situation where events, demands, and support interact in highly variable, inconsistent, unexpected, and unpredictable ways. And where, stable structures, procedures, all these things become less stable and reliable. Basically, that means that we may be more susceptible to we have a more complex society, basically, and it comes back to my question: how do we plan for these things? And there's a bit of a deficit on the in the terms of our capacity to plan, when complexity of the global society and our own societies is just growing, right? So basically, that scale there shows that there's too much complexity, like Chris Ansel describes there. There's so much complexity, and that undermines our capacity to plan for anything, or plan in general for unknown crises or unknown threats. And probably lots of you guys know this guy. It's Nassim Taleb from the University of Princeton, who came up with this. Well, it's not exactly his invention, but he has developed this concept of the black swan, which is an extremely unpredictable or unknowable and unthinkable event. Whereas the white swan is like the earthquake in Haiti, or the earthquake in Chile, or the storm that is raging right now outside my walls here in the Faroe Islands is the whitest of all swans, probably because we have so many storms here. Probably have that in Shetland as well. So how do we plan for these black swans? That is the main question. Well, Taleb actually provides a little bit of hope here. He says that what may be a black swan surprise for the turkey is not a black swan surprise to its butcher. So the objective should be to avoid being the turkey by identifying areas of vulnerability, trying to turn black swans white. I'll get back to how, sort of in more concrete terms, how we can actually do this. But we really like plans. People, we human beings basically are really attracted to these things where we watch. It's pervasive through all of our fiction that we really like movies where, you know, there's the A-Team, which I grew up with in the 90s, when Hannibal always ends the episode by saying a plan. I love it when a plan comes together. We really like these kinds of films and books, and you know, there's Ocean's 11, and there's so many different examples. The Italian Job, all of these movies where we see someone having complete control of all the variables, making a plan and executing the plan to absolute perfection. And it's so satisfying. And we really need to distance ourselves from this completely fictitious way of looking at planning. We cannot use this type of very sort of positivistic planning approach in governance and risk planning, because this will never be something that we can actually achieve in real life. That's one of my basic points. And we've also seen this development in planning theory, which was a big thing throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, where you went through a big like paradigm shift within planning theory from having a very positivistic, very sort of early modern kind of look at planning, where you thought, well, we can just control for everything, and we can just plan our way out of all problems, until there was this shift in the planning theory literature where people said, well, we really can't, and it's actually counterproductive to be trying to control everything. So you went to a more sort of pluralistic and adaptive planning approach or planning theory, where focus is more on flexibility and participation instead of having this complete control of all variables, or imagining that you had complete of all, which is also similar to this really interesting concept that I came across quite recently by Jack Anderson in the Department of Homeland Security in the US. Wrote about this, and he says the problem with this positivistic planning approach is that you're actually using the fortress as a metaphor for society, where you're trying to withstand all threats, and trying to create this sort of absolute security. And he says this is the same thing as the positivistic planning approach, where you're basically, it's counterproductive. It's just an illusion. You're never going to get there anyway, and you're just spending resources on things that you're not going to be able to calculate everything and have control of our overall variables. It concentrates risks, and when the fortress falls, society falls. So instead of recreating a societal fortress, you should be trying to do something else, which is what he calls, yeah. So he writes, there's two problematic tendencies: applying risk management when the information necessary for such calculation isn't available, and then boundless precaution, which he thinks is also going from 90% security to 100% security is really like a resource, something that you spend a lot of resources on, instead of going from 50% to 60%, so on. So he proposes a more of a decentralized, he calls it the unfortress. So decentralized resilience, which aims for reasonable security, which is much more achievable and much more flexible. And it's not totalitarian, as he calls the absolute security outlook. So these are the sorts of things that I'm sort of trying to get my head around right now in my PhD, especially because I'm coming towards the end. I'm going to have to write an introduction for all of these papers and tying all these things together. So these are the main reflections. How do you plan how do you plan a society to be able to cope with completely unthinkable events? So I worked with a Finnish guy, Sebastian Goldenhjelm, for last year, and we were writing a paper on public entrepreneurship, and we had a meeting on Zoom, and we made an agreement that we would go out and find examples of entrepreneurship during the pandemic in each of our countries, and come back 3 weeks later, and he said, I've looked everywhere and I can't find a single example of entrepreneurship or innovation in the Finnish society during COVID-19. And I said, really, that's interesting, because I found like 3 or 4 really good examples. I explained it to him, and he said, those things would never be possible in Finland, because Finland has this quite belligerent neighbor on its eastern border, which means that Finland is the most planned society in the whole world, which means that there's very little room for innovation. So basically, if we turn that on its head, it means that the Faroe Islands, we like to brag that we were quite innovative during COVID-19, but basically maybe that's a problem because we had no plans whatsoever. So I'm not sure thing or it's a bad thing. And this is the conundrum, in this whole sort of philosophical discussion, I guess. But we have this interesting quote from a civil servant. I did the COVID-19 evaluation for the government in 2022, 2021. And he said, he basically confirms this thing that we don't need planning in the Faroe Islands. He said, I'm not sure that a detailed plan based on a hypothetical example would have been very helpful, considering the constant need to assess the situation, make decision based on rapidly changing circumstances, and so on. So basically saying, this is a civil servant in a leadership role saying, we don't want a plan. We basically just want to improvise because we're really good at improvising. And I'm not sure that's the best approach. I haven't decided what is the best approach. You probably need some planning, I guess, but we'll have to. Yeah, I haven't decided yet, but I'm writing on these things. It's probably going to fill a little bit of my discussion chapter. So basically, it's got me thinking, and in terms of Shetland, the Faroe Islands, and communities like this. So what is it exactly that we're learning from these things? I mean, we're really small societies. So where does the smallness come into the whole discussion of the fortress and the unfortress and crisis management? And basically, what I think we've learned so far, and I'll come back to this in a little bit from the COVID-19 pandemic, is that there are certain types of crises that the Faroe Islands, at least, are really good at coping. Can cope. Whereas for other things, we need to distinguish between absolute capacity and relative capacity, because in terms of absolute capacity, countries such as China or the US, of course, has more resources than the Faroe Islands, which we can compare to that big ship there. Whereas in terms of relative capacity, for example, if you really want people to behave in a certain way, and you really want the message to come out really quickly, and you want to, shift the course that you set 2 weeks ago, or you want to, I don't know, put the brakes on or accelerate, then suddenly that small boat is where you want to be, right? But when there's a big storm, the big ship is probably better off than the little boat, I guess. But there are different crises that are better suited for larger societies, more complex bureaucracies, and then there are other crises where smaller societies can actually cope better. That's the central point. And one of the examples of this is our testing scheme in the Faroe Islands, which was pretty much a world beater during COVID-19. This is the amount of tests made during the first year of COVID, or until 31st December, where the Faroe Islands tested its own population 3.7 times during those 9 months. The second, third, and so on are to the right of that picture, Luxembourg and the UAE and Bahrain. And then we have some of our neighbors, Denmark, the United States, United Kingdom on the left there. So this was pretty much due to our smallness that we managed this. But it was also a bit of a coincidence because we had this salmon preparedness, and we are number 10 in the world in salmon exports, and we are number 100 and something in terms of human population. So when you suddenly take the resources from the salmon preparedness and use those resources for human population, you get the world's best testing scheme. So this is one example of, the small society coping pretty well during a crisis. And I've done I've looked into all the documents, the evaluation documents. I've done some interviews with officials, and I found lots of examples of these are all subcategories of robustness, according to Chris Ansell, and you're looking for different sort of characteristics of robustness. And I don't want to go through these in detail, but there are certain characteristics that you can observe in the documents and in the communication between organizations. And just let's take the last one on this list, the ability of Faroe society to mobilize societal resources. So high trust, voluntary compliance, highly homogeneous society, very homogenized media landscape. It's very easy to get messages out to everyone and so on. Of course, with the dark side of having a high degree of social control and a high degree of sort of social or rural panopticon, rural surveillance, I guess we can call it. So these are some of the characteristics. We also, I could also observe a high degree of speed, and this is also something that you might recognize from Shetland, that when you need to implement something, you can do it really, really quickly compared to a larger community or a larger society. You can really go in fast, and this is really important in a crisis situation. But of course, there's always a con. When there's a pro, there's always a con. And in these terms, we've actually seen this now with vaccine skepticism and things like this. Some things, when you go very quickly, might have some long-term effects. We're not sure exactly that it's affecting vaccine skepticism, but it's a hypothesis that's people are sort of discussing right now in the Faroe Islands. So an overuse of soft law, for example, which is a very quick governance tool, might have some long-term effects, because you're moving accountability away from those who are actually elected or accountable, right? And then of course there's trust, which is a huge thing, and we're coming back to what Sissal mentioned earlier, care as a critical infrastructure. I would say same thing about trust, high degrees of trust, which are very difficult to measure. I've done some surveys on this, and I've used self-reporting. I don't know if every one of my respondents actually understands this word trust in the same way, but we're getting some results which are quite interesting, which I will share with you in a moment before I end. But basically, trust is a complexity reducing resource. So if you go back to the scale that we had earlier, with the complexity weighing heavier than it has done before, which undermines our capacity to plan things, then having a high trust in society can actually make the complexity lower. So it helps us to plan and helps us to make decisions. It simplifies our decision making. It reduces the need to have all of the information and have all of the control over all of the variables, which is a very good thing. So however you can, try and maintain or boost this trust in society, both in terms of between organizations and in the citizenry in general. But there are some challenges ahead. I think, at least out from our results, we could see that there's the one that is probably most worrying is that the youngest age group, which was from 18 to 29 years old, they reported significantly less trust than all of the other age groups, which may mean that we're facing a future with a more skeptical citizenry, right? Which is not as voluntary compliant as people have been in the past. This may not be a problem. This may only be a symptom of a healthy democracy. I'm not sure exactly what to make of this, but at least this is something that authorities should be aware of. Oldest group was most trusting of the government and experts and all of these things, and also interpersonally between citizens. The second youngest group was least happy with measures that where we were closing schools and limiting children's activities and things like this. And the second youngest group is the 30 to 39, the people who probably are most likely to have children. Women were more trusting than men, and people from high incomes were more trusting than the ones with low incomes. And this is a really interesting, a really weird result, because we had this same survey made in all of the Nordic countries, and the Faroese mean is lower for all of these 14 different COVID measures, which is completely baffling and something that I haven't been able to explain. But I never expected them to be lower than the Nordic mean for all of the measures. It's very weird, and I've thought about why this is, and I'm unable to provide a good answer. It might be because the danger levels seemed lower in the Faroe Islands, so that the measures seem more extreme or something like this. But that's completely, I mean, we're out in completely speculative territory there, which is a very strange result. I'm nearing the end. Is my time almost up?
Yes, if you could wrap it up, that'd be grand, Rógvi.
Yeah, sorry, I can't hear you, Andrew, but anyway.
Yes, please, if you could just round it up, Rógvi, that'd be great.
Yeah. Just showing you a couple of slides more. We can see here the one that I mentioned earlier with the youngest age group being the reporting the least trust. And we can see that both in terms of trusting people in general, which is the left image and left figure, and then trusting the Prime Minister, which is the right figure there. The same thing with trusting the Epidemic Commission, which is like the epitome of the health experts, I guess, in this term, in this instance. And then we had the same thing in terms of people agreeing with the propagation of vaccination and all of these things. Youngest age group was also mostly more skeptical than the others. So just to to sort of finish off here, I've mentioned most of these things before. We should aim for a reasonable security, not absolute security, more of a flexible kind of resilience, decentralized, and always ask, is there any way we can reduce complexity? Right now, there's a risk assessment strategy being conducted by the Faroese government, which we will probably collaborate with. And basically what they're doing is cataloging and categorizing likely threats, in terms of likelihood, impact, and temporality, and all of these things. And preparing for unthinkable events by simulating a cascade of unlikely events, because you can't simulate an unthinkable event because it's in your blind spot, right? So think about the least likely thing that you think about, make up 3 of those and try and simulate what do you do if these things happen. That's maybe a way to tackle black swans, and then try and paint those black swans white or gray at least. And then I have to end with trust, because it's just like it's such an important thing. And if there's any way that governance can actually maintain or boost trust in society, enhance it is absolutely crucial, because it is a way to reduce the need for actually having that much planning capability, because it just reduces transaction costs all over society. When I walk to work in the morning, it takes me 10 minutes to walk. But if I'm afraid that someone's going to jump around the corner and stab me in the back or something, then I'm not walking to work. I'm taking my car. I'm spending resources on these things. So, I mean, in all of the small things, trust just plays a huge part, and at least in crisis governance. So that's basically my talk. I'm sorry if I went over time. Andrew, I couldn't actually hear what you said earlier because I'm not sure if my sound is working or...
Well, that can you hear me now?
Yeah, I still can't hear.
Okay. Well.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Oh,
thanks.
that was wonderful. Lots of thought-provoking material there. Adaptive resilience. I like that concept. I think it's something that you find innately in a lot of island communities. And the relationship with trust is an interesting one. I put in the text that I have a feeling that Shetlanders don't have a great deal of trust in their councillors, and it needs more research. But I think as a society, people tend to trust each other here. If something goes wrong, you trust that somebody will help you. You trust that you'll be safe when you're walking around in the streets. So there's a feeling of a feeling of safety. I mean, it might be misplaced, but that's why people don't lock their cars or don't lock their houses. Maybe they do in the centre of Lerwick, but not out in the rural parts of Shetland. So I think trust is a vital resource, and I hadn't really thought about that so much. But thank you for bringing that to our attention. So we'll leave any questions that we might have until the end, but there's already some interesting comments being put in chat. So remember, everyone, you can do that. And we'll now go to Adele, who's coming from the wonderful archipelago of Orkney.
Hi, everybody. Just bear with while I pull up this presentation. Can everyone see that okay and hear me all right?
Yes, absolutely. Nice and clear.
Excellent. So yeah, as Andrew said, I'm based here in the Orkney Islands. I'm 50% Shetlander. So I have family ties to both Orkney and Shetland. Let me just set this going and then I can forget about it. And my research is looking at the Scottish National Islands Plan. So maybe managing multiple strands of what's been discussed or attempts to wrangle some of these complex issues from a kind of policy perspective is what I'm looking at. And I've come up through the UHI as it stands. So I've lived and worked in the islands for all my years, and organisations like the UHI have significantly improved opportunities for islanders like myself to kind of take part in tertiary education, and I suppose be an embodied example of some of the issues that we talk about around islands. But my background is kind of I've worked in local authority here and also worked on implementing a number of renewable energy development projects. So trying to put some of these projects into practice in an island setting. So a kind of a diverse background, I suppose, but it makes sense through the island. And as I was working on these other projects, it was consistently legislation and policy boundaries that kind of stopped you in your tracks the most when you were attempting to do things. So here's the island of Flotta in Orkney with the oil terminal pictured there, which has been fundamental to the kind of policy background and I would argue the political culture of the islands, particularly of Shetland and Orkney, and more so as we talk about renewable developments and things in our contemporary times. So I'm specifically looking at whether the Islands Plan translates into benefits for island communities, what impact does that have on island council institutions, and I would maybe put a retort to Andrew's suggestion that people don't trust their councillors. I would say they don't trust maybe the institution of the council rather than, not in all cases, rather than individual councillors, because we have this sort of, we see each other all the time in the supermarket. So there's a really naturalistic form of feedback, for these policymakers that are based on the island. They're making policies and they're being very scrutinised at individual level for decisions that they make. So we saw that during COVID as well with some of the measures that came in, that people are watching you in the nicest possible way. So you have to be on your best behaviour in some sense. So I thought there would be a map of the island, so I've quickly squizzed one in here. So the Islands Plan covers all the islands in Scotland, hundreds of them. There's around 100,000 islanders or thereabouts, just over. 3/4 of the islanders, about 75%, live either Shetland, Orkney or the Western Isles. As we come down the west coast, about 25% of the islanders live further south here on the map there. And the islands that are further south have local authorities that are mainly mainland orientated. So Highland Council, Argyll and Bute Council, North Ayrshire, Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles all have unitary local authorities. So kind of from the 60s and 70s, they have had separate organisations running local politics for their own needs. So really, some of the things we talk about here as we go through are quite unique in governance terms for islands. So tends to be in islands research that islands will negotiate independently or bilaterally with central authorities for various things. But we saw a bit of a buck in that trend with the islands, the big three, as they're called in policy research of Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles. So really, a lot of this discussion is about how national policies tend to have adverse impacts on islands, and this was a theme that kind of runs through the research. So the islands are aging, so there's a discussion about population decline, but we can see that mainland Scotland has a higher change in population. So the islands are depopulating quicker, but they're also depopulating in working age and youth population. So we can see that, 23% of children and 15% of a decline in working age populations, which somewhat undermines economic development as a means for growth and change in islands if you're not having labour inputting into that economic development. So there's kind of feedback loops that work in that. We have ageing population, so majority of population in Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles are of pensionable age or above, and then that has impacts on the cost of living. So we have to utilise ferries in between our islands and onto the mainland, and the cost of transport is much higher, and that has a much larger impact on pensionable age, which means that pensioners on islands are twice as impacted by the cost of transport as they would be on mainland Scotland. And then we also have things like poor housing stock, so old housing that's not well insulated, which increases rates of fuel poverty, and as income reduces, those rates of fuel poverty increase and are further impacted just by our climate. So we have these kind of complex interactions where national policies don't quite address some of the problems that we experience on islands. So the National Islands Plan was published in 2019 to enact some of the aims for islands in the Islands Scotland Act, which in generally I think can be summarised as in improving outcomes for islanders. Whatever those outcomes are is decided along the way. So there's a 30 million budget over 5 years, which was slightly reduced, and a number of programmes that have come out of that, which has mainly seen funding being delivered directly into community organisation groups, and not really delivered through the local authorities, which has been a major issue of contention and shall we say, discussion throughout this piece of research. However, there have been positive aspects so far of the Islands Plan where the Islands team have managed to ring fence additional funding through the Scottish budget for islanders based on some of those factors that we saw in the last slide. There's been work looking at gathering information about how climate change might be tackled on some of the smaller islands. So in Orkney, our least inhabited island has got 8 inhabitants on it. Some of them have a few hundred. The mainlands tend to have a few tens of thousands. So it's really looking at the kind of blunt end of how we deliver projects across these kind of spatially diverse groups of islands, and managing how budget is spent, decisions are made, who's receiving what. So I've taken this kind of process evaluation approach. What's been delivered to who and how much has it cost? It's kind of how it can be summarised in that. It's been evaluated annually so far by the government. There's annual reports, there've been COVID impact assessment, route maps published, so it's a fairly transparent process, I would say. The main forms of sharing discussion come in the form of 2 different types of stakeholder groups that the government holds. So there's one for kind of high up policymakers, decision makers, and then there's one at kind of officer level, so planning officers, people in community development groups, operators of ferries and things like that. I did have to put in a freedom of information request, which Erica doesn't let me live down, to receive some of the financial information. But since that process, the kind of funding that islanders are going to receive now appears in the national budget. So you can see up front what's going where and what's being spent where. It's now coming through that national process. So it has made some alterations as it's gone along. The plan has 13 strategic objectives, which respondents have said is too many, but when asked which ones they would remove, they couldn't. So I think that's more a kind of typographical issue. I just kind of added this line at the bottom about crises, and each one of these things on the left has been discussed in a narrative of a crisis, a care crisis, a population decline, housing crisis, education crisis, but crises are temporary in nature, and this maybe indicates there's a more systemic issue at play if there are continual crises over long periods of time across multiple strands of policy work there. And the Scottish Government is aiming to implement these strategic objectives through the implementation process and this narrative that runs through Scottish politics about empowerment, the Community Empowerment Act and things like that. Most of the work from the Scottish Government side has been on this islands proofing process, as well as the carbon neutral islands projects. We can't criticise the government because there's been quite protracted and continual consultation process. So the Scottish Government is required to carry out consultations as part of, the political process in Scotland, and tens of thousands of islanders have been fed back into the process in person and also through targeted surveys. The local authorities have kind of been left out of that process of the development of the plan, and also as to provide feedback into the workings of the National Islands Plan. It wasn't until 2021, 2 years after the National Islands Plan, that local authorities were specifically targeted for consultation and their opinions on how that National Islands Plan was working. And post 2021 was the first time we saw funding from the National Islands Plan being delivered directly to local authorities for local authorities to decide what was going to happen. The tendering process is competitive, so each local authority is kind of competing for funds one against the other, which is probably not the most efficient use, but the government reported that it allows them to see what trends are coming up in what local authorities are specifically requesting to do with those funds. So there is a kind of reason why, even if the local authorities are not quite happy about that process. But my research focuses more on a qualitative aspect here. So there's lots of quantitative data, which has different implementation effects depending on how many population are in the island. Sometimes it throws up issues of confidentiality, but we also sort of start to see this disaggregation, that the amount of data collected doesn't always equate to the ability to make decisions from the data that's been collected. It doesn't always apply to each island. So the government themselves identified that there was a need to ask how the implementation was going of the National Islands Plan, but it was also kind of identified in the process of developing the National Islands Act, this requirement to measure qualitatively. But the Islands Plan didn't come from nowhere. The Islands Act didn't come from nowhere. The three island authorities, Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles, in 2013 got together and developed an islands campaign that looked across a number of areas: common pool resources, sea and on land, constitutional change. This was kind of driven by EU policy processes, which islanders were able to influence how the EU policies were developed, and then got a really sufficient say in how EU policies were applied and how they participated in those. The great thing about the EU directives was that there were multi-year funding strategies. So communities had 7 or 8 years to deliver projects, whereas with the National Islands Plan, it's per annum, and often there's a really short window of weeks or months to deliver projects as well, which is not really a strategic approach. They looked at economic drivers, so there was this kind of ideological similarity with how the islands wanted to approach their problems, and islands proofing kind of entered the fray in that. But they were also buoyed by a number of policies in the background. There was, sufficient policy landscape, shall we say, that was giving the islanders confidence to say, well, we want a bigger say in what we're doing, and we think these things tell us. But there's also a kind of human rights aspect as well that runs under that. That's a kind of universal principle on that. So it's kind of led me to think about policy paradigms as I'm writing up this project. Does the Islands Act and the National Islands Plan contain the same policy levers for islanders as some of the previous changes in policy allowed for them? So in the 1960s and 70s, as oil was being developed, as you saw in my first slide, Shetland Islands and the Orkney Islands negotiated directly with support from the Westminster government to be able to negotiate directly with oil companies, and they were able to amass strategic reserve funds of hundreds of millions of pounds that they have successfully managed over 8 decades to the benefit of islanders, to plug the gap in national service provision, care, housing, roads, leisure, all these kind of lifestyle services, as well as the local authority. So does the Islands Act, the Scotland Islands Act, the National Islands Plan have significant policy levers that islanders can rely on to enact some of the changes that they're willing to see? And I think what we're seeing is a bit of an erosion of the powers that they negotiated. So islanders, the Silas, the big three, they have this background. They have 80 years plus of negotiating and building this political identity, that part of an island identity that's taken very seriously. And as the county council acts in the islands, some of the national policies and committees, we're talking about sustainability for islanders in 1964. It's not a new concept. There was concern that industrialisation would erode what it meant to be islands, and there was a really nice kind of balance between development and an understanding of heritage. And a lot of islanders, a lot of the islanders and industry, aside from the bad side, I think it seems like a paradigm to be talking about oil in these terms. But when we talk about renewable developments, we're not really seeing the same measures for islanders that were there when Flotta was developed, or Sulimvo in the islands. And what we really saw was the island local authorities becoming policy entrepreneurs and taking the helm and really identifying problems and politics and providing solutions for these problems and political questions there. The Islands Plan is up for review. So is there a sufficient window of opportunity now for islanders to guide their own strategies for their future into the next iteration? What we don't see this time round either is this social capital that was materialised through the 3 local authority groups working together. They've kind of gone off on their own way, and again are starting to or continue to negotiate with the centre, because I think in part that the mechanisms are competitive. There's an advantage to not sharing your strategy in essence, because you're applying into a bid and that you're waiting to hear whether the money comes back. So I've been using the policy processes life cycle to kind of write up my chapters, political agendas, problematizations, who was involved in the implementation, has that led to successful uptake of the policy mechanisms that have been developed through the National Islands Plan and the Act, and really looking for early areas of opportunity, gaps and success. Complexity has already been discussed today. I think I was just listening to a podcast while I was out walking the dog, and they were talking about family dynamics and how one member of a family, what they do implicates other members of families, you know, in a roundabout way. And I think this is kind of how islands work. You know, any one of these stakeholder interactions impacts another stakeholder interaction, and that works within an island, but it also works intra-island. So what Shetland does has a roundabout impact in what opportunities are for Orkney, opportunities are for the Western Isles. So, you know, the Western Isles hasn't had a strategic reserve fund, and the local authorities are, to add another crisis, they're starting off their annual, you know, economics planning in a massive budget deficit, Shetland and the Western Isles. Orkney's on its way down there. So even the financial kind of position for the islands is unsustainable as it currently stands. Yeah, so I've been carrying out stakeholder interviews as the main kind of way, my main data gathering technique, and these issues of trust came up in multiple ways. The social capital, you know, the islands felt confident enough to work together, and we have this narrative in Scotland that not all islands should be treated the same, but there are sufficient similarities that a national policy can be effective in the islands. You know, we're talking about housing, transport, connectivity, depopulation, all the things that the plan has identified are common amongst islands. So there is sufficient commonality there. When the islands developed their own campaign, you know, they had this legitimacy, they were backed up by local, national, regional, international policy. We've seen a policy change in the UK with Brexit, which is going to have a significant impact for islands in terms of funding. But there's a lack of legitimacy around the National Islands Plan and its mechanisms, certainly at that local authority level. It feels that it's a capacity burden on an already stretched organisation. You know, there's additional requirements, additional statutory processes that they have to undertake, but no additional capacity to deliver them, not funding or personnel. The participation, like I mentioned, a lot of the interviewees felt that they didn't have sufficient input into the processes or the delivery, and therefore the influence was kind of limited. And resources comes up again, and power across a number of ways. Who should be deciding what and why? And I think, you know, it becomes kind of obvious over time where the local authorities have been integral to this political process, and there's this sense that they're feeling a little undermined by the National Islands Plan coming and telling them what to do. So I've been trying to identify outputs and outcomes and mechanisms for change as I've been writing up my chapters, and I'm nearing the end of the presentation, Andrew, if you're worried about time. That there's this sense of marginalisation. The budgets are ever diminishing and the responsibilities are ever increasing. That local authorities in particular felt there was a lack of clarity around the policies. Islanders felt that there was a lack of trust. They didn't feel empowered by the process, and that parts of the National Islands Plan were perhaps not fit for purpose. Issues of budget, how to use data for the Scottish Government, and then in the community organisations, there's a sense of marginalisation, not just from the National Islands Plan, but there's there's no link up or limited link up between local authorities and community development groups. So I think there's a real opportunity there to help foster trust, social capital with local political organisations like local authorities supporting community development trusts, because they're working towards the same outcomes as each other, but they've kind of been placed a little in competition as the government's chosen to give part of a budget to local authorities and part of a budget to community development trusts. And really the time scales that a lot of these projects have to be delivered on are extremely tight, weeks for some of them. There you can see that green bar at the bottom there, that these are individual islanders felt that the Islands Plan didn't really affect them that much. And the government's own research on this there on the left showed the same thing. So there's something there. You know, everybody agrees they've picked up the right things, but really it's the process of implementing it is perhaps where the biggest gap is, where we're in the next iteration of the National Islands Plan, perhaps co-developing the new plan and how it's going to be delivered with islanders and island institutions could perhaps be made better. So there was notes there about it's not a strategic approach with pots of small bits of money, but some of the changes that are not the National Islands Plan, some of the changes to policy that were also influenced by the Ireland's Our Future have been useful, have increased a bit of income, and these ones specifically are where communities get to decide where the money goes for themselves, and there's not the pots are ring fenced and there's not this competitional element for that. And here is from the same survey that I did. I had around about 150 responses, so people could answer or not answer, that islanders felt that local authorities, that Scottish Islands, are justified in calling for additional power. So there's this idea that the island's own influence over politics and its own decision making is generally supported by the islanders that filled out this survey. And just to give a quick overview of the funding, when we look at how the funding's been spent so far, it looks pretty equal here on the left, but when you consider it by head of population, the island local authorities, Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles that only cover islands have actually had less pound per head of population than the kind of less populated islands further down. So that's just a summary of what I've already said, really. Stakeholders feel a bit disengaged. Rural proofing hasn't been enough. It's complex, that perhaps more could be done to align different stakeholder stakeholder groups, and that there could be better indicators for success through the National Islands Plan. And then I just have this last slide that says, so what? Hardly anyone lives in islands. But what we actually see is lots of resources there. This is the offshore wind on the map on the left. Rosebank, one of the most controversial oil discovery of our time. What's that got to do with wind turbines? Well, Equinor is large shareholder of both Viking wind farm there on the bottom right and Rosebank there in the middle. I think Equinor just came out and said that they're going to reduce their aspirations for offshore wind yesterday or the day before. But there's also this unique identity. There's this absolutely brilliant leaflet that the Scottish Crofting Foundation there posited. This is starting to look at islanders through a kind of through this human rights lens, these cultural identities of people who have always lived here, and does that constitute an Indigenous population? These conversations are starting to materialise. But these are the areas where I say new economics and political innovation are put on trial. Things are implemented really quickly. We see transitions happen between industries, social requirements, the social services and welfare are kind of put on trial very swiftly in the islands. And actually what we see is a lot of political trends happen on the islands first. Depopulation, renewable uptake, transition through an oil economy. Those all happened first on islands, and the UK government actually uses its rural proofing process as an indicator for general policy trends across the whole population. So they're not backwards. They're too far ahead in time sometimes. So that's why islands are significant, I think, in the political process in Scotland. So thank you. Hopefully I didn't go too far over. But yeah, whistle-stop tour of islands and the Islands Plan.
Thank you very much indeed, Adele. And it sort of brings together some of the issues raised by our other two speakers as well, that these are the Islands Plan is sort of trying to address some of these things, but perhaps so under the radar, because nobody's really aware of that this is going on. We have some really nice comments in the chat, and some of the questions have already been addressed therein. So I think, unless somebody wants to speak up and ask a question, it would be actually really interesting if our three speakers asked each other a question. Is there something from what you've heard that you'd like to pick up with one of the other speakers?
I've already commented on this in the chat, but I could ask Adele. This is something that you recognize in your work. I've been a couple of times in the Faroese Parliament as part of a consultation process, and you get in there and you have 10 minutes, and then you speak a little bit, and then it's clear from the body language of these people that they actually don't want you there. They just want you out of there so they can tick a box. And they can make a big list of inputs from consultations, and very often I think consultation processes, at least in the top political system, is like this. Is that something that you've seen as well, or do you recognize that from your end?
I think it's a massive discussion. I think yeah, a lot of people just see it as a tick box exercise. I think in the National Islands Plan is unique in that it's had so many consultation events from different inputs, and the first one was actually, to give the islands team their due. They traversed a great number of islands, 63 islands. They went there in person. They've done follow-up consultations. I think, the loop gets lost because how is the information fed back? And I think, people go along to the consultations and then don't really see the fruits of the input process. So I think there could probably be more to kind of tie up that end. But I think we see it through the chain as well. So even through so our councils, are elected democratically here. They are representations of islanders, but even they felt that they hadn't been included in the process. And I actually, as part of my fieldwork, did go along to a consultation event where the government said that they had been talking directly to local authority, and about 3 or 4 employees stood up and, has anybody, so they were in the room and they felt they hadn't been informed. So there was this element there of a further kind of erosion of trust. But it's difficult to balance that. But I think in this case there has been surveys, but it hasn't just been a tick box exercise. But how the data is used in a meaningful way, I think still there could be more work done on closing that loop. It might not necessarily mean it's not done, but we're not seeing how it's being influenced.
There's an ancient article from '69 called the Ladder of Citizen Participation, which I think probably most people are aware of, where this thing is called tokenism. It's quite a good concept, I think, if you find that useful. Anyway.
Thank you very much, Rógvi and Adele. Sissal, you've got your hand up.
There's also other questions, but I don't know if we're...
Yeah, please fire ahead.
All right. Well, this kind of follows up on what both Simon and Laurie commented on my presentation as well, and very nice comments. Thank you. I am very interested in the question of how do we do this research that engages with islands and also with smallness, and what does this mean for the questions you ask, the material, or the methods you use, the materials you include, and what you ask your data, so that's my question, which is maybe more of a wish for you to elaborate a little bit on how you've gone about thinking what methods, what data, what people, what questions, how have you gone about trying to address the challenges that islandness, smallness, isolation, how that is visible. That was very badly formulated, but I hope you know what I mean.
Shall I go first? I'm going to answer the question in the way that I understood it, so you could just correct me if. But what I connected on with your question was, how do you actually compare these places? So the whole comparative thing, and you're doing field work in 3 different places, and I'm not exactly sure how to do this, but you really have to account for particularities, because there's so many different very particular things. I mean, in my own example with the COVID governance, it was the salmon thing. So how are you gonna compare? Sorry, I have a sick kid at home. He's not that sick. He can still shout from the other room. We are going. And then when you're comparing places, what are the actual particularities? And you have to probably tease those things out and not use them in the comparison because they're not really relevant. If you compare the Faroe Islands with the Bahamas or something, I mean, it's just, yeah. So I find that a really difficult thing to do, and I really like other people's comments on exactly how to navigate that, the comparative thing.
Adele?
Yeah, I don't have a note on comparative. I mean, I have looked around and involved, myself in island studies from elsewhere. But for me, I think I'm in a privileged position in that I am an islander. And, I'm situated in what I'm studying. It has other issues that you have to consider, but also, I've prioritized island voices in my research, and most of my interviews, and even those from the government side or the public bodies, were islanders themselves. So I really have, taken it. It's central to my approach was, how have I identified the stakeholders, and they identify themselves as islanders in some way. And actually, in the case of the National Islands Plan, a lot of the freelancers that went into the development of the National Islands Plan were themselves islanders based on islands. So I think, from that point of view, but I am involved in a kind of research group that's kind of starting to come up with best practice for island research. Institutions like our own, lorries based on PEI, elsewhere when you visit islands, islands have research institutes and research institutions, and including those in stakeholder groups, project delivery groups, I think is a really great way, because there's this kind of embodied element that when you're in an island research institute, that so much of your research is kind of, it's not always, but it's based on, inherits this island knowledge within it. So I just always say that when I'm in these fora, that utilize island researchers and utilize the island institutes that are there doing the work already.
Thank you, Adele. And you've found particularities within the Scottish Islands as well, because Shetland is not the same as Barra, and North Ronaldsay is not the same as Unst. So there's all these varieties, sort of heterogeneous research. Simon, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, kind of just riffing off that question I put.
You're very quiet, Simon. Could just about hear you, but
sorry, put my thing down. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, you're all looking obviously at islands, but actually what struck me is that you're grappling with problems which aren't really about islands. They're actually much wider significance. You're looking at care, you're looking at resilience, you're looking at political disengagement and disenfranchisement in some sense, which are actually critical problems for society much more generally. So I maybe just encourage you all to think not so much about what you can do for your islands, but actually what your islands can actually contribute to a wider political discourse and sociological discourse about what we need to do next. And that would be the question. What do you think we should be doing differently in your islands and more generally as a species, perhaps?
That's a big question. Okay,
that's a huge question. But I think that your question, Simon, is the holy grail of small states and islands and microstates research, because what can we actually contribute to the world, right? Which parts of my results are actually useful in, I don't know, in a UK context or in a German context? And that's a huge question, and that's the one that I want to answer the most, I guess. But for me, it's to tie it into my presentation, I think it's how do we reduce complexity? I think, I mean, there must be some way that you can reduce complexity also in a huge bureaucracy. How do you enhance trust? How do you make sure that different stakeholders that never actually have met meet, and because that's what we saw in during COVID in the Faroe Islands, that organizations that had never had any collaboration actually established collaboration or intensified their collaboration with other organizations. So these things are probably, I think, learning outcomes that bigger societies can actually use. I think that's only one example, I think.
If I can chip in, yeah, humans are great at handling complexity. I think it's when we are relying on kind of, I don't know, in the UK, we saw this modernization agenda, which aimed to kind of take big data and try and posit solutions from aggregated data, which works to an essence, but actually the human brain and the organization, what you were just saying there, of different groups being able to quickly, to use your kind of small boat, organize themselves around problems. What we've seen in the UK is that we've had this huge emergence of community development organizations that pop up to fill the gaps in service provision, and it's good in one way, but it's also indicative of a problem with another part of the system. So where I think conditions allow for some flexibility and freedom, or this agile kind of approach, what was discussed earlier, where that's allowed to occur. Because I think what happens at the moment, certainly in this context in Scotland, is ambitions are sort of clipped because we have these ideas of, not that there shouldn't be, but basically the overall measure is the economic performance of an organisation, and there's not, I think, a serious consideration of the social and environmental and the environmental impacts. And actually, local government is actually very good at doing that. And I never thought I would be so, complimentary of local authorities. They get a hard time.
It's all relative, isn't it?
That's
it's
right,
like
exactly.
compared to central government, local government is really well connected.
But these community groups and these local organisations, are very good at making balanced decisions based on economics and social. So I think, where we can empower those fully, not just in plans or written documents, but starting to allow, give them some autonomy and authority to be implementing these decisions and having high up strategies at the national level, I think in our circumstance would be great.
Thank you very much, Adele. And Sissal actually had a couple of very interesting phrase that would address some of the things you were asking, Simon. Thinking with islands.
Yes, exactly. And I don't have as a substantial answer, and I don't have any empirical findings to base an answer upon right now. But my response would be exactly thinking with islands in the way we're also connected to what Rógvi and Adele said, doing a bit more bottom-up research, putting people at the center, or asking a bit more open questions to see what is actually happening, and that also. This is also connected to what Laurie said earlier in the comments of our understanding of care and whether it should be institutionalized, whether it should be following a certain pattern or a structure. We have so narrow ideas or normative ideas on this, but in reality, it's much more complex, and they're a bit of thinking with, and not just examining what is the impact of a certain thing, is, I think, a good start, at least. You're muted.
Well noticed. Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Sissal, for that answer, and thank you to all our three speakers. I see Rógvi has had to leave us, so I'd just like to say thank you very much for three wonderful presentations, lots of thought-provoking material there, and I think the future of islands research is looking rosy, which is all very exciting. So thank you very much indeed. We will be having another PhD session in a few months' time. We'll have to find a date for that, but it shows the the importance of getting new young researchers to present their material. It's just great. For those who want to attend the next series of Faroes Shetland Research Symposia, we have some titles or some themes coming up which we need to just finish off the final details. So we're hoping to have one looking at a language in Shetland and the Faroe Islands in March. Hopefully something around autonomy, home rule, and the value of doing it for yourself in April. And in May, we're looking to explore inequality and gender issues in the islands. And in June, we have a sort of an exciting topic, witchcraft in the islands, where we get some folk together to talk about older traditions and more recent ones, like laying on of an amos in Shetland, and see and explore what sort of witchcraft practices might still be done in the Faroe Islands. So we have to finalize these, but watch this space. And thank you again, everyone, for your attendance, and particularly thank you for the speakers. It's been great. So all the best now.